Welcome to Serial Killer Files. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're diving deep into one of the most shocking and complex criminal cases in American history. This isn't just the story of a serial killer. It's the story of a trial that would test the very foundations of our justice system, challenge our understanding of evil, and forever change how we investigate cold cases. What you're about to hear contains disturbing content, but it's a story that needs to be told. Because buried beneath a ranch-style house in Norridge, Illinois, lay not just the remains of 33 young men and boys, but the dark secrets of a man who lived multiple lives, contractor by day, Democratic Party organizer by evening, and children's entertainer on weekends. A man who called himself Pogo the Clown. This is the complete story of John Wayne Gacy, from the horrifying discovery that shocked the world to the historic trial that captivated a nation, and the modern DNA breakthroughs that are still bringing closure to families today. Enter the twisted world of Serial Killer Files by Skoob, your all-access pass into the darkest corners of the human mind. Uncover the sinister secrets behind the world's most notorious killers, from their haunting childhoods to the gruesome details that gripped entire nations. This isn't just storytelling. It's a raw, unfiltered descent into real-life nightmares. Obsessed with criminal psychology, forensic twists, and the eerie clues that crack unsolvable cases, Serial Killer Files is your next addiction. Powered by Skoob, the AI-driven podcast platform built for true crime fans. This series delivers over 1,500 bite-sized episodes, packed with chilling facts, shocking revelations, and edge-of-your-seat suspense. Stream Serial Killer Files now, only on Skoob. Available on the App Store and Google Play. Think you're brave enough? Hit play. The truth is waiting, and it's far more terrifying than fiction. Now let's start from the discovery that changed everything in the John Wayne Gacy case. December 1978. Snow was beginning to fall across the Chicago suburbs when a sheriff's deputy received a report that would forever haunt him. Human remains had been discovered in the crawl space beneath a seemingly ordinary ranch-style house near Norridge. The deputy immediately contacted investigator Stein, who arranged for disposable coveralls to be delivered to the scene in Norwood Park Township. When Stein arrived, he found nearly a dozen law enforcement officials already there. Deputy Chief Richard Quagliano, Lieutenant Frank Braun from the Major Investigations Unit, all directed by Sheriff Richard J. Elrod to collaborate with local police. You see, Gacy's residence lay within an unincorporated section affecting multiple jurisdictions in northwest Cook County, making this immediately a complex, multi-agency investigation. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to find. As Stein approached the house, he was immediately hit by an unmistakable odor, the smell of decay. Dressed in protective coveralls, he descended through a trap door into what can only be described as a nightmare. The crawl space was oppressive, dank, suffocating. An evidence technician pointed to something that resembled human hair. In the beam of flashlights, the horrible truth became clear. Human bones. At least one complete skeleton, and then another. But as they continued their inspection, they realized this was far worse than anyone had imagined. Other curious mounds suggested additional graves. This wasn't just a murder scene. It was a graveyard. Stein made the decision to halt the recovery until daylight, treating the site like an archaeological excavation to preserve every scrap of evidence. The premises were sealed, guards posted overnight to protect what had become one of the most significant crime scenes in American history. While investigators prepared for what they knew would be an extensive and gruesome excavation, the man suspected of these heinous acts was still being questioned at the Des Plaines police station. John Wayne Gacy sat with his attorney, undergoing intense questioning by seasoned investigators, including Assistant State's Attorney Terry Sullivan and Sheriff's investigator Greg Bedo. The net had been closing around Gacy for days, and perhaps there was a sense of reluctant relief as the relentless pursuit had finally ceased. Investigators laid out the damning evidence, informed him of his rights, and waited as Gacy delivered what would become one of the most chilling confessions in criminal history. By early Friday morning, John Wayne Gacy had confessed to the murders of over 30 individuals. But this wasn't just any confession. It was delivered with a disturbing enthusiasm that would haunt investigators for years to come. Gacy's associate, Dave Hatchmeister, who spent extensive time with him during questioning, noticed something deeply unsettling about how Gacy recounted his crimes. He seemed to enjoy it. Gacy would describe in vivid, detailed accounts how he preyed on his victims, often utilizing his clown persona to engage them in what he called magic tricks. He would lead them to submit to having their hands restrained, and once they were defenseless, he subjected them to sexual abuse and what he called his sick fantasies. His method was methodical, calculated. Gacy would position himself behind his victims, using a rope or wooden plank to strangle them from behind, slowly squeezing the life from them. The enthusiasm with which he described these murders was almost as if he were trying to impress the detectives with the elaborate nature of his crimes. Hatchmeister observed something particularly chilling. Once Gacy began discussing the murders, he divulged information incessantly. This led investigators to believe they had uncovered the full extent of his criminal acts. If there had been more victims, more hidden bodies, Gacy's narcissistic need to boast would have compelled him to reveal them. But even before his arrest, Gacy had been making what can only be described as farewell rounds. On the day of his arrest, he made several stops that seemed like goodbye visits. His final stop was particularly telling, a restaurant at the intersection of Milwaukee and Oakton, where he met with his friend David Cram. There, in what must have been a moment of overwhelming psychological pressure, Gacy made a chilling admission. He confessed to Cram that he had murdered 33 young men. Cram's reaction was immediate terror and disbelief. He quickly informed detectives, and his genuine shock reinforced investigators' belief that Gacy had acted alone. But Gacy had been dropping hints to others as well. Ron Rode recounted his interaction with Gacy shortly before the arrest. Gacy arrived looking disheveled, as if he hadn't slept all night. The first thing he requested was a scotch and water on the rocks. As they sat in Rode's kitchen, Gacy mentioned needing to visit the cemetery to say farewell to his best friends, for what he believed would be the last time. When Rode questioned this strange statement, Gacy, appearing somber and emotional, placed his hands on Rode's shoulders. With tears in his eyes, he confessed, "Ron, I have been a bad boy." When Rode tried to downplay the situation, Gacy shocked him by admitting to killing 30 people, give or take a few. Rode was speechless, later describing the conversation as being blindsided, like receiving a shot right between your eyes. Despite his skepticism, Gacy's demeanor suggested this was no joke. When Gacy prepared to leave, a rosary slipped from his coat, strange for a man who had never been known as religious. But perhaps most disturbing was Gacy's final request. He asked Rode for a gun, suggesting he intended to use it against those closing in on him. Rode firmly refused, telling Gacy he would not go down using one of his guns. As Gacy's confessions continued, the full horror of his crimes began to emerge. He had been burying victims beneath his property until health issues and lack of space forced him to change his methods. His final 5 victims were disposed of by dumping them into the Des Plaines River. Among these was Robert Piest, the young man whose disappearance had led police to Gacy in the first place. In a shocking revelation, Gacy admitted that when Officer Kozenzak had inspected his premises, on December 12th, Piest's body was still in the attic. The audacity was breathtaking. While police searched his property, evidence of his latest murder was literally overhead. Gacy also disclosed that he kept bodies within his home for extended periods, though he remained evasive when questioned about what he might have done to them post-mortem. This detail would later become crucial in understanding the psychological profile investigators were dealing with. The burial process itself revealed Gacy's methodical nature. He had teenagers working for his construction company, David Cram and Gregory Rossi, unknowingly dig what would become graves under his house. They were told they were digging for plumbing or foundation work. Gacy would then bury the bodies and cover them with lime to accelerate decomposition and mask the smell. This wasn't the work of someone experiencing brief episodes of psychosis or uncontrollable impulses. This was calculated, planned, and executed with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The trial of John Wayne Gacy would become one of the most sensational and significant legal proceedings of its era. After 4 intense days of jury selection, 12 primary members and 4 alternates were chosen for what everyone knew would be a historic case. The venue itself was as dramatic as the case it would host. The trial took place at the renowned courthouse at 26th Street and California Avenue in Chicago, a building with a long-standing legacy of hosting high-profile cases argued by some of the most famous attorneys in history. But even by this courthouse's standards, the Gacy trial was exceptional. Judge Garripo's courtroom on the 6th floor was an architectural marvel that resembled a Hollywood set. Rich dark hardwoods blended with smooth marble, while massive 8-foot oak doors opened into an expansive room featuring 25-foot ceilings adorned with intricate crown moldings. Rows of pew-like benches provided seating, ending at the bar that separated public spectators from the court's active area. Large windows on the south wall allowed morning sunlight to stream in, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere in the early hours. A green desk lamp and brass nameplate denoting Judge Garripo's authority were prominently displayed on the imposing judge's bench. But this wasn't just any trial, and preparations reflected that reality. Minor renovations were made to accommodate the scale and scope of the proceedings. The jury box was resized to accommodate the additional alternates. Most notably, bulletproof glass partitions were installed, literally drawing lines between the gallery and the well of the court to ensure security. Press arrangements were equally elaborate. While no cameras were permitted inside the courtroom, reporters were positioned to observe without causing disruptions. Outside, the scene resembled a media circus. Streets were flanked by large white broadcast trucks equipped with satellite dishes and emblazoned with logos of various television networks. It was as if the entire world had stopped to witness this judicial spectacle unfold. Judge Garripo demonstrated clear intent to manage this efficiently, establishing a demanding schedule. 6 days of proceedings each week, with full sessions on Saturdays. He was determined to navigate through the substantial evidence and numerous witnesses without unnecessary delays. One of the most contentious pretrial issues involved the state's plan to use a large easel displaying photos of 22 identified victims, interspersed with 11 question marks for unidentified victims. Each slot could be modified to swap pictures during testimonies. The defense argued this constant display might unfairly prejudice the jury. But after careful deliberation, Judge Garripo allowed the easel to remain, though it would be covered unless directly referenced during witness testimonies. The result was that throughout the trial, the defense team found themselves sitting with this gallery of victim photos looming behind them, a constant, haunting reminder of the stakes involved. Even before the main trial began, the Gacy case generated unprecedented security concerns. During one pretrial hearing, these concerns reached their peak, creating a situation that highlighted just how volatile this case had become. Media was informed that a hearing involving Gacy would begin at 9:30 a.m., but officials had quietly developed a different plan. Gacy was scheduled to be transported from Kermack Hospital around 10 o'clock, with an anticipated arrival at the Civic Center an hour later under significant police protection. By 7:30 a.m., both uniformed officers and plainclothes operatives were strategically positioned around the Civic Center. These law enforcement personnel were stationed at various entry points, coordinated through two-way radios, with vigilant watches maintained from rooftops and office windows of nearby buildings. As Judge John L. White commenced regular court proceedings at 9:30 a.m., additional bailiffs worked with court staff to screen all attendees through metal detectors. But by 10:30 a.m., rumors began circulating that Gacy might not attend. At 11 a.m., Chief Alfano received formal notification. Gacy would remain at Cermak Hospital. At 11:30 a.m., Judge White informed attendees that Gacy's absence was due to security concerns. Judge Fitzgerald later elaborated, explaining the potential danger to Gacy given the heightened emotional state of the community and threats from individuals who might believe they were acting for the greater good by harming him. While there were no direct death threats, the Des Plaines Police Department had received peculiar religious pamphlets and letters addressed to Gacy. One bizarre correspondence suggested that spaceships should stop leaving people like Gacy on Earth, a detail that underscored the surreal nature of a public reaction to the case. Gacy's attorney, Sam Amarante, was shocked by this unexpected development. He strongly objected to proceeding without his client, arguing that Gacy had a fundamental right to be present and criticizing the lack of advance notice. Despite these objections, the hearing proceeded. Judge White granted Amarante's request for psychiatric examination to evaluate Gacy's mental capacity and ability to aid in his defense. The Cook County Psychiatric Institute was designated to perform the evaluation, though Amarante could also appoint a private psychiatrist. Additionally, the judge imposed a gag order preventing witnesses and public officials from making statements that might compromise Gacy's right to a fair trial. This early hearing also revealed the human cost of Gacy's crimes. Members of the Piest family attended, sitting in front-row seats. During the defense's motion to dismiss murder charges in the Piest case, arguing no body had been found, Harold Piest was seen reassuring his wife with a supportive hand on hers. After the hearing, officers discreetly escorted the family from the room, shielding them from media attention. If you're fascinated by real crime and the dark minds behind history's most disturbing killers, Serial Killer Files by Skoob is your next obsession. Dive into shocking cases, unnerving interviews, and the bone-chilling psychology that turns ordinary people into monsters, all delivered in fast-paced episodes built for non-stop listening. Tap follow and subscribe to Serial Killer Files on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, and stay locked in to every unsettling new episode pulled straight from the shadows of true crime. You'll never look at the world the same way again. Now let's return to the Gacy case. When the main trial finally began, the prosecution and defense faced a unique challenge. How do you prove what was in the mind of a man who committed such unspeakable acts? The answer came from an unexpected source: those who survived. Jeffrey Rignall's testimony would become one of the most powerful and disturbing moments of the entire trial. Ironically, it was the defense that called him to testify, hoping his graphic account would support their insanity plea. What happened instead was a window into the calculated evil of John Wayne Gacy. With his psychiatrist present for support, Rignall recounted his harrowing experience from March 1978. He described regaining consciousness near the Alexander Hamilton statue, partially clothed, his face stinging intensely from chemical burns. Passers-by helped him return to his residence on Wellington Avenue, where his shocked roommate aided him to bed and later contacted authorities. But what made Rignall's testimony so powerful wasn't just the horror he described. It was his determination to find justice. After initially receiving a callous reception from police who seemed to dismiss his account, Rignall took matters into his own hands. He conducted surveillance at a ramp on Cumberland Road, looking for a vehicle similar to his attackers. This led him to Summerdale Avenue, information he provided to police. When police finally showed him mugshots, including one of Gacy from Iowa, Rignall's identification was immediate and unequivocal. "I will never forget his face. That was John Wayne Gacy." Despite having a suspect, Rignall grew frustrated with the investigation, feeling dismissed as if his account was fabricated against a seemingly model citizen. When progress stalled, Rignall did something extraordinary. He confronted Gacy personally, writing him a letter and even visiting his home. There, he encountered Gacy's mother, who casually asked if he planned to attend a party that evening, to which Rignall replied with understandable incredulity. During his testimony, Rignall's distress was palpable. He often seemed on the verge of tears, trembling while narrating his traumatic experience. When describing the scene of his attack, he desperately called for his psychiatrist. The emotional weight became too much. He was physically sick, leading to an abrupt court recess. But Rignall wasn't the only survivor to testify. Robert Donnelly's account provided an even more detailed look into Gacy's methods and mindset. Donnelly was 19 years old, an upstanding young man who had recently graduated high school and taken a job to support himself while putting off college plans. The deaths of his father and grandfather had taken a toll on his mental health, resulting in a brief hospital stay. But by summer 1979, he was determined to chart a positive course for his future, having earned a state scholarship and federal grant for college. On December 30th, 1977, Donnelly had spent an ordinary evening with friends on Chicago's Northwest Side. As he waited at a bus stop in the early morning hours, a dark car approached with its spotlight fixed on him. The driver, John Wayne Gacy, demanded to see his identification. Believing Gacy was a police officer due to his PDM company license plate and attire of dark blue pants, black shoes, and black leather jacket, Donnelly complied by leaning into the car. In an instant, Gacy pointed a gun at him. "Get in, or I'll blow you away." What followed was a night of systematic torture that revealed the calculated nature of Gacy's crimes. Once at Gacy's house, the contractor pushed Donnelly onto a couch in a recreation room, then changed into casual clothes and began drinking heavily. Gacy reflected on his life, noting his age as 35 and lamenting the lack of respect he felt he received. His anger simmered beneath the surface, expressing disdain for women and now for Donnelly. The power dynamics were deliberately crafted. Gacy offered drinks that Donnelly refused, leading to escalating anger. When Donnelly declined a second time, Gacy grabbed him by the neck and forced the drink down his throat, reinforcing his twisted belief that any offering should be accepted regardless of circumstance. Gacy uncuffed Donnelly, ostensibly as goodwill, but warning that resistance would lead to deadly consequences in his soundproof domain. He forced Donnelly to put handcuffs on himself, using physical aggression, a slap, to enforce obedience. What Donnelly endured that night included rape, repeated suffocation, and mockery of simulated drowning. Gacy dragged him into a water-filled tub, tightening a rope around his neck repeatedly, prolonging terror with each lost breath. After each blackout, Donnelly awoke to find Gacy continuing his cruelty, taking perverse pleasure in the suffering. Perhaps most chilling was Gacy's game of Russian roulette. He placed a revolver to Donnelly's head, pulling the trigger in calculated gambles while casually discussing the types of lives he preferred to extinguish. He shared supposed experiences of previous murders, ramping up psychological tension. When the revolver clicked on empty chambers, Gacy's macabre declaration was punctuated by laughter. "Ha ha ha, you're dead!" revealing the ammunition was blank, designed to deepen his psychological control. The nightmarish encounter didn't end there. Gacy resumed his physical dominion, maintaining choking grasps until Donnelly succumbed to unconsciousness repeatedly. These testimonies revealed the calculated nature of Gacy's crimes. This wasn't sudden impulse, but methodical torture designed to satisfy his sadistic desires. As the trial progressed, it became clear that this case would hinge on a fundamental question. Was John Wayne Gacy insane when he committed these murders? The legal battle that ensued would become one of the most complex and controversial insanity defenses in American legal history. Under Illinois law at the time, the death penalty could only be applied for first-degree murder when multiple murders or additional severe offenses were involved. Gacy was charged with 33 murders, aggravated kidnapping, deviant sexual assault, and taking indecent liberties with a minor. The state's reinstatement of capital punishment in 1974 meant prosecutors could pursue the death penalty for the 12 murders Gacy committed after this law was restored. Gacy's defense team, led by Sam L. Amarante and Robert Mata, centered their strategy on an insanity plea. They argued that the abuse Gacy endured from his father had caused detrimental effects on his mental health. To support this defense, they presented psychological evaluations indicating Gacy suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and what was then termed multiple personality disorder, now known as dissociative identity disorder. A successful insanity plea could have landed Gacy in a psychiatric institution instead of facing execution. However, if deemed recovered, there was the potential risk of eventual release, a prospect that terrified prosecutors and the public alike. The prosecution's strategy, led by William Kunkel, along with Terry Sullivan and Robert Egan, was to demonstrate Gacy's lucidity and premeditation. They pointed to his deliberate actions, employing teenagers to dig graves in advance, concealing bodies with lime, and continuing his normal business operations between murders. Over 13 days, they brought in 60 witnesses, including former employees who depicted Gacy as a menacing sexual predator. But it was the psychiatric testimony that would prove most crucial. The defense presented multiple experts who diagnosed Gacy with various mental disorders. Dr. Reifman observed that while Gacy appeared open and candid, he was actually evasive and initially denied responsibility for his crimes. Gacy claimed to have 4 distinct personalities: John Gacy the clown, John Gacy the politician, John Gacy the contractor, and a personality named Jack Hanley. According to Gacy, Jack Hanley was responsible for the murders, while Gacy himself had no memory of them and was unaware of Hanley's actions. However, Dr. Reifman found significant flaws in this claim. He testified that since the murders were committed without witnesses, Gacy himself was the primary source of information about them. The fact that Gacy could provide substantial details about the murders indicated his awareness and involvement, contradicting his claims about Jack Hanley acting independently. Reifman found no evidence supporting the theory of multiple personalities, a finding reinforced by other psychiatrists and psychologists who assessed Gacy. He also disagreed with theories about brief psychotic episodes or irresistible impulses, using the analogy of someone desperately needing to vomit in a socially inappropriate setting. Unlike such genuine impulses, Gacy's actions showed clear planning and premeditation. The evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. Cram and Rossi had testified about digging graves under Gacy's direction, indicating he planned these murders in advance. This contradicted any theory of impulsive behavior. Dr. Helen Morrison, the defense's final witness, diagnosed Gacy with mixed or atypical psychosis. Despite his high IQ, she testified that he had not emotionally matured, maintaining the emotional development of an infant. She believed Gacy's psychosis had been present since at least 1958. During cross-examination, Morrison stood by her assessment that Gacy was psychotic when he killed Rob Peast, even after considering his subsequent activities like conducting business calls and disposing of the body. When asked whether Gacy would have committed murder in the presence of a uniformed police officer, Morrison surprisingly replied affirmatively. The prosecution countered with Dr. Jan Fawcett, chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center. Fawcett indicated that while he couldn't completely rule out amnesia, he believed Gacy was aware of more than he disclosed. He opined that Gacy did not suffer from a mental disease and did not meet Illinois criteria for an insanity defense. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was Dr. Reifman's assessment that Gacy was malingering, deliberately attempting to feign insanity. Despite Gacy telling Reifman that pretending to be insane would be stupid and insisting he was not insane, Reifman believed Gacy was trying to fake mental illness. Reifman's view differed from other psychiatrists like Dr. Hartman, Dr. Friedman, and Dr. Rappaport, who did not believe Gacy was faking a mental disorder. However, Reifman was confident that Gacy was attempting to fake a split personality, finding this evident during his interviews. When asked whether someone who committed such terrible acts might naturally try to attribute them to another personality, Reifman acknowledged that an intelligent person like Gacy would attempt to deflect blame. However, he described Gacy as intentionally vague, trying to create confusion to avoid accountability. On redirect examination, Reifman reiterated his belief that the creation of Jack Hanley was a strategic move by Gacy to invoke an insanity defense and circumvent accountability for his crimes. As the trial progressed, dramatic moments punctuated the legal proceedings, creating an atmosphere unlike any other criminal trial in American history. The 7-story courthouse bustled with activity as reporters filled 50 seats specifically allocated for media, while additional seating was arranged for family members and friends of Gacy's victims. The visual impact was deliberate and powerful. The prosecution's easel displaying photos of 22 identified victims, interspersed with 11 question marks, served as a constant reminder of the human cost of Gacy's crimes. Throughout the trial, this gallery of victim photos loomed behind the defense team, creating an almost surreal backdrop to the legal proceedings. These images served as stark reminders of the case's gravity as attorneys battled over evidence, testimony, and the overarching narrative of justice and accountability. The defense presented testimony from Gacy's mother and sister, sharing stories of physical and emotional abuse he suffered at his father's hands. They emphasized an incident of domestic violence Gacy witnessed as a toddler, potentially impacting his psychological development. 22 witnesses testified for the defense, including 6 psychologists who argued for Gacy's alleged insanity during his criminal acts. On several occasions, Gacy himself interjected during proceedings, claiming confusion about what was happening. Some interpreted this as dissociation, others as performance for the court's benefit. However, on March 7th, Judge Garippo affirmed that Gacy was competent to stand trial. The defense also brought forward character witnesses from unexpected quarters. Jack and Elaine Shields, acquaintances from the clown community, testified about Gacy's character. Anthony DeBlas, connected to Gacy through Democratic politics, spoke favorably about his organizational skills, specifically mentioning his efficient management as secretary-treasurer of the Norwood Park Township Lighting District. DeBlas noted that Gacy seemed to work tirelessly, almost putting in 23-hour days. However, during cross-examination, DeBlas stated he believed Gacy was sane, a response that likely damaged the defense more than it helped. In court, outside the jury's presence, Gacy made a brief statement asserting his inability to contribute to understanding his own actions, thus waiving his right to testify. This decision likely frustrated defense attorneys who had built their case around his alleged mental illness. The psychiatric testimony became increasingly complex. Dr. Brosher was prepared to discuss the definition of insanity when Judge Garippo interrupted, noting the jury would receive direct instructions about legal definitions. When Prosecutor Kunkel asked if Brosher agreed with Dr. Carl Menninger's assertion in The Crime of Punishment that psychiatrists should not participate in courtroom proceedings, Brosher disagreed, arguing that most legal professionals lacked understanding of psychiatry. This exchange highlighted the fundamental tension in the case. Where does medical expertise end and legal judgment begin? Closing arguments began on March 11th, marking the end of one of the most intensive legal battles in American criminal history. The defense maintained their argument for insanity, while the prosecution underscored Gacy's persistent threat to society. Psychiatric evaluations dating back to 1968 from Gacy's first arrest had detailed his antisocial personality disorder diagnosis, indicating a profound lack of empathy, unfulfilled deviant sexual desires, and disregard for human life. These factors suggested that treatment was unlikely to have any remedial effect. In prosecutor William Kunkel's closing argument, he made a compelling appeal to the jury's sense of justice, urging them to show the same lack of mercy that Gacy had exhibited toward his victims. To punctuate his statement, he dramatically threw a set of victim photographs into the trap door that led to Gacy's crawl space, an exhibit that had been prominently displayed throughout the trial. The message was clear. Gacy had shown no mercy to these young men, and the jury should show none to him. The jury's deliberations were relatively brief for such a complex case. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. More significantly, they recommended the death penalty, a decision that reflected not just the heinous nature of the crimes, but their rejection of the insanity defense. John Wayne Gacy was sentenced to death and would eventually be executed in 1994, 16 years after his arrest. But the story of the Gacy case was far from over. Even during his time in prison, Gacy continued to demonstrate the manipulative skills that had served him throughout his criminal career. His earlier experience in Iowa State Men's Reformatory provided a blueprint for how to navigate the prison system to his advantage. When Gacy was first imprisoned in Iowa in 1968 for sodomy, he had appeared resolute in securing early release through exemplary behavior. Recognizing the dangers of prison life, particularly for someone convicted of sex crimes, Gacy strategically befriended three influential inmates: Raymond Cornell, Larry Polsley, and Dwayne Fulton. These men provided mutual protection against potential attacks. Within this protective group, Gacy felt secure enough to cultivate a reputation that contradicted his true nature. He loudly condemned homosexuals, hiding the real reason for his conviction. Instead, he falsely claimed he had been penalized for showing pornographic films to teenagers, a lie that made him seem less threatening to other inmates. In the prison kitchen, where he worked as a food service worker, Gacy maneuvered himself into an unofficial supervisory position. Under his management, food quality improved, premises remained immaculately clean, and Gacy even extended his authority to command respect from guards. He successfully protested the inclusion of a known homosexual on his team, getting the worker reassigned based on his argument that such individuals shouldn't handle food preparation. Gacy took care of his close friends by providing them with premium cuts of meat and special culinary treats. He grew particularly close to guards, from whom he obtained civilian shirts and his preferred cigars. His affinity for being in charge was noted by Cornell, who observed that Gacy always seemed to have money, leading to suspicions about possible loan-sharking activities. Thanks to his commissary duties, Gacy could stay out of his cell until midnight, using these late-night privileges to possibly conduct various activities that further established his influence within the prison system. This pattern of manipulation and control would continue throughout his incarceration, demonstrating that even behind bars, Gacy remained the same calculating individual who had terrorized Chicago. Decades after Gacy's execution, modern technology would breathe new life into his case, bringing closure to families who had waited years for answers and revealing surprising discoveries that no one had anticipated. When Sheriff Tom Dart took an active role in investigating Gacy's unidentified victims, substantial advancements followed. He dedicated complete resources of his office, including advanced DNA analysis technology, to assist in identifying victims who had remained nameless for decades. For families who had spent years not knowing the fate of their loved ones, the resulting clarity offered much-needed resolution. Laura O'Leary was a teenager when her 19-year-old brother, William George Bill Bundy, vanished in 1976. For decades, she suspected he had fallen victim to Gacy's crimes, but lacked concrete evidence. This heartbreaking uncertainty continued for over 30 years until DNA evidence finally confirmed her worst fears. In November 2011, authorities announced that Bundy had indeed been another victim of the killer clown. Until that point, Bundy was known only as Victim 19, but genetic testing led to confirmation of his true identity. He became the first of 8 unidentified Gacy victims to be named following the purposeful identification effort that began in October 2011. But DNA testing also provided shocking revelations that challenged long-held assumptions. Sherry Marino had spent over 30 years visiting the gravesite where she believed her son's remains were interred, despite authorities telling her that her son Michael was body number 14 found at Gacy's property. Marino always doubted this identification. DNA testing finally vindicated her doubts. The remains were not her son's. Michael Marino had disappeared 36 years prior and was last seen at a hamburger restaurant near Clark Street and Diversey Parkway, an area where police knew Gacy hunted for victims. His case remains unsolved. Perhaps most surprising were discoveries of people presumed dead who were actually alive. Investigators tracked down Richard Hutton, believed to have been another Gacy victim living in Montana. This marked at least the 5th presumed victim found alive within just 2 years. Investigators followed Hutton's trail after his sister Edith Hutton submitted his name as a possible match for unidentified victims. Her brother Robert matched the profile of Gacy's typical victims and had seemingly disappeared after last communicating with family in 1972, saying he was hitching cross-country from New York to California. Given that Robert might have passed through Chicago and worked in construction, Gacy's preferred method for luring victims, the family feared he had become another tragic case. But modern investigative techniques revealed he was alive and well, living under a different identity in Montana. Sheriff Dart emphasized the diligence with which his team pursued leads like Hutton's, because they matched profiles of victims Gacy typically targeted. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy had murdered 33 young men and boys, most found beneath his home, with others discarded in the Des Plaines River. These modern developments demonstrate how technology continues to impact cold cases, bringing closure to some families while opening new questions for others. The Gacy case, even decades after his execution, continues to reveal its secrets. As we conclude our journey through the Gacy files, we're left with profound questions that extend far beyond one man's crimes. This case challenged our understanding of evil, tested our legal system's ability to handle complex psychological questions, and demonstrated both the power and limitations of justice. John Wayne Gacy was often described as a narcissist who frequently boasted about his perceived intelligence and success. His associate Dave Hatchmeister recalled how Gacy regarded himself as the most accomplished small businessman, often giving advice to pharmacists about product placement and claiming they followed his suggestions. This narcissism extended to his crimes. He seemed to derive satisfaction not just from the acts themselves, but from recounting them to investigators. Gacy possessed a disturbing ability to charm others, which Hatchmeister described as both strange and unnerving. Despite being a dangerous individual, Gacy maintained a facade of friendliness and politeness that made him a proficient con man. He attempted to evoke sympathy from detectives, regularly portraying himself as a victim in a world allegedly against him. However, experienced investigators like Hatchmeister recognized him as a manipulative bullshit artist. The question of accomplices was thoroughly investigated. While curious about whether Gacy had help, investigators firmly believed he acted alone. The young men who associated with Gacy were streetwise but seemingly oblivious to his monstrous crimes. David Cram's immediate terror and disbelief upon hearing Gacy's confession reinforced this belief. What made Gacy particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize his life. By day, he was a successful contractor. By evening, he was active in Democratic politics. On weekends, he entertained children as Pogo the Clown. This ability to maintain separate identities allowed him to operate undetected for years while satisfying his murderous urges. The trial itself became a test of our justice system's ability to handle questions about mental illness and criminal responsibility. The psychiatric testimony revealed the complexity of diagnosing mental illness, especially when the subject has strong motivations to deceive. The battle between prosecution and defense psychiatrists highlighted how the same evidence could support dramatically different conclusions. Ultimately, the jury rejected the insanity defense, concluding that regardless of any mental illness Gacy might have suffered, he understood the nature of his actions and their consequences. This verdict reflected society's determination that some acts are so heinous that mental illness cannot excuse them. The modern DNA investigations have added another dimension to the Gacy story. They demonstrate how technology can bring closure to families decades after crimes occurred. But they also remind us that some questions may never be answered. The discovery that some presumed victims were actually alive speaks to the chaos and confusion that surrounded missing persons cases in the 1970s. When communication between jurisdictions was limited and record-keeping was incomplete. The Gacy case also highlighted the vulnerability of young men in American society during the 1970s. Many of his victims were runaways, drifters, or young men from troubled backgrounds, people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. This case helped change how missing persons cases are handled and demonstrated the importance of treating every disappearance seriously. Perhaps most disturbing is what the case reveals about the nature of evil itself. Gacy wasn't a monster hiding in shadows. He was a successful businessman, a political volunteer, a children's entertainer. He lived among us, worked with us, entertained our children. This challenges comfortable assumptions about our ability to recognize dangerous individuals and forces us to confront the reality that evil can wear a very ordinary face. The families of Gacy's victims showed remarkable courage throughout the trial and in the decades since. Their presence in that courtroom, facing the man who had destroyed their lives, demonstrated a strength that stands in stark contrast to Gacy's cowardice. Their pursuit of justice and truth, continuing even decades later through DNA testing, shows that love and determination can outlast evil. As we've seen throughout this case, John Wayne Gacy was many things: a killer, a manipulator, a liar, and ultimately a coward who preyed on the vulnerable. But he was also, tragically, a human being, and that might be the most disturbing aspect of all. Understanding how an ordinary person can become capable of such extraordinary evil remains one of the greatest challenges facing criminology, psychology, and society as a whole. The Gacy case reminds us that justice is not just about punishment. It's about truth, closure, and the ongoing effort to protect the innocent. The modern DNA investigations continuing to this day show that the pursuit of justice doesn't end with a conviction or even an execution. It continues as long as there are questions to be answered and families seeking closure. In the end, the true legacy of the Gacy case may not be the horror of his crimes, but our response to them. The determination to seek truth, the commitment to remember his victims, and the ongoing effort to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive into the Gacy files. This case remains one of the most complex and disturbing in American criminal history. challenging our understanding of justice, mental illness, and the nature of evil itself. If you or someone you know needs support related to violent crime, please reach out to local victim services or the National Center for Victims of Crime. Remember the victims, their names, their stories, their families who continue to seek answers and closure. In remembering them, we honor their lives and commit ourselves to protecting others. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and this has been another chilling episode of Serial Killer Files, where we expose the darkest motives and most disturbing crimes ever committed. If today's story shook you or left you needing more raw, unfiltered true crime, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you feed your obsession. Want even more hard-hitting, no-filler true crime stories? Check out Skoob, the AI-powered podcast app made for the truly obsessed. With thousands of short, gripping episodes curated to your tastes, it's the fastest way to spiral deeper into the shadows. Download Skoob today on the App Store or Google Play and unlock your next true crime fix.